right, wonderful. We are back. Thank you all for being here. We have one last session before the next coffee break, so stay tuned now. We have Mark from the Bangkor Foundation that's going to be telling us a little bit about the mechanics of Bangkor and how everything works. So let's give it a round of applause for Mark.
Thank you, Crypto Valley. Yeah, so my name is Mark Richardson. I am the product architect and the head of research at Bancor Protocol, which is a decentralized liquidity system built on Ethereum. And I have designed this presentation to sort of appeal to the widest possible spectrum of different assumed knowledges, and also different backgrounds. So just be aware that there are going to be some slides which, I kind of break the golden rule of never displaying any equations, because I know that there are people in this audience that will be interested in precisely how Bancor version 3 is designed to operate and how it makes liquid markets. If your eyes glaze over when someone is showing you and walking you through some of these mathematics, just be a little bit patient with me, because I have some other more helpful, more intuitive ways of demonstrating these systems that I think that you will find very helpful. Now, in the spirit of having no assumed knowledge, can I just get a quick show of hands? Who can articulate what a liquidity pool is? Okay, it's about half the audience for those streaming in. So in these few slides, I'm just going to quickly describe what these are, or at least how I would articulate it. And I would call a liquidity pool just a smart contract that contains crowdsourced capital, right? Crowdsourced meaning sort of decentralized, coming from many individuals rather than from a singular source. And I think that this is a helpful generic term for a liquidity pool because it covers all kinds of different use cases. For example, a lending protocol could be called a liquidity pool, or a yield aggregator could be called a liquidity pool. And a sensible next question then is, what is an automatic market maker? Again, quick show of hands. Who thinks that they could articulate on stage right now what an automatic market maker is? Okay, maybe about 20% of the audience. I consider an automatic market maker to be a protocol that allows liquidity pools to exchange cryptocurrencies with each other. Okay, and I hope that that is a fair enough definition. But I think the more interesting question is, why are automatic market makers important, right? Why did Bancor invent this technology in the first place? And that one is maybe slightly more difficult to articulate. I won't ask the audience whether or not they could do it. But for me, automatic market makers are a part of an emerging decentralized global financial network. And what is much more important than just the fact that it has a global financial network behind it and the fact that it's decentralized, but it is organic. Right? An automatic market maker is very difficult to trick. It doesn't get passionate. It doesn't get emotional. It doesn't panic when something is happening. And with the way that traditional markets are run, you generally have an emotional being behind a computer somewhere that is making decisions that actually have global ramifications at times. So, for example, I remember the 2008 financial crisis, when it was revealed that one of the currencies was partially collateralized in was partially collateralized in one of the bank's stocks that went belly up. The market panicked. And it's not necessarily because all market participants everywhere in the world all panicked at once, but because a few centralized entities got nervous, and they kind of panic on our behalf. And that is why I think automatic market makers are important, because they are algorithmically determined, and they do not have emotions, and they tend to respond in very predictable ways. So why then are they able to work, or what makes them work, what makes them function? And this is where we're going to get a little bit math heavy, but I promise it will be over in, it will be over fairly efficiently, and so just bear with me if you don't like these slides. But the method that we are using, and Bancor developed several different types of bonding curves when it first launched, but Bancor version 3 uses just one of them, which is the constant product bonding curve. Who's seen this picture before? Right, almost everyone. Terrific. But I wonder if anyone could describe what it is, or what it does. right? Maybe if you're a geometry student or something, you would recognize this as a hyperbola or a cone section or something like that. But really, what it is meant to be portraying is all of the discrete points where two different reserves have some value. So if X and Y are two different assets, then this line, this curve, is all of the different ratios that a liquidity pool or an automatic market maker is allowed to have. We call this a bonding curve if you don't know the nomenclature. And so let's just quickly walk through how a bonding curve operates. I'm going to do some of these calculations for you again. It's not too much of a headache. So let's assume that X and Y in this case are the BNT token, which is the native token of the Bancor network, the universal numeraire token. And Y we're going to let be Chainlink, which is one of our deepest liquidity pools. Now, the bonding curve is about to perform its role, right? It's going to accept some input from the user, perform an exchange, and then deliver the token that the user wants back to them. So let's assume here that the user wants to swap 10 BNT tokens for some number of Chainlink tokens. And it's up to the protocol, it's up to the algorithm to determine the outcome of this transaction. For the constant product bonding curve, we're going to assume two different reserve balances of 100 each, which means that under this hypothetical, BNT and Chainlink have the same price. Now, we call this a constant product bonding curve because when you multiply those two reserves together, you get some number. And the idea is that that number is supposed to remain constant, hence constant product. Now, that's a bit of a misnomer because it's not really constant. There is a small commission that allows the constant to slowly drip off over time, and I'm going to come back later in this presentation to explain precisely why that is, but just remember that it's there. For the sake of these calculations, I'm actually going to leave it because I expect that some of you may want to refer back to this presentation later, maybe for self-study. So the protocol's job is to take all of these inputs, the state of the bonding curve, and the user's request, and process that into a trade. And this is essentially the mathematics that determines that. I'm not going to walk through this. But essentially, you are taking x0, which is the first state of one of the reserves of that pool, and you're adding x to it, which is the amount of tokens that the user was hoping to swap. And that is going to deliver a new state for the pool, which we're going to call x1. y1 is the same thing, slightly different equation, but generating another valid output. And k, we don't generally calculate this on the contracts because it's unnecessary. You can deduce it from the state of the curve, but if you wanted to calculate it, this is exactly how you would do it. So these values then become the new state of the pool, right? This will be the new balance in the smart contracts in the next block on the Ethereum blockchain. But what about what the user received? So we have an equation to determine that as well. And you can actually intuit that this answer must be right? You could write like a unit test or something for this. Because here, you can see that y0 on the left-hand side was 100, and the amount of y1 that we have calculated below it in blue is 91, and the difference there is 9, and that must be the amount of tokens that the user is receiving. And so the fact that we have like an independent source of truth for that this swap amount is what the user is receiving is nice, but you wouldn't necessarily build that into a protocol because you can deduce one from the other. But this is the result. We've now completed the swap, the algorithm has done its work, and the bonding curve is now at a new state. The user has lost all of their BNT tokens and have received the correct number of link tokens. Now, this is the part that I hope that some of you are being patient for, which is I know that some of the geometric portrayals of these things, the algebra, is, if not confusing, at least boring. And so I thought that I would generate for this conference a slightly more intuitive way to think about what it is an automated market maker is doing, right? What does it mean when you take 10 BNT tokens and move down a bonding curve to some other point on it? Imagine you are an apple merchant, and rather than price all of your apples at exactly the same price, we're now going to apply some arbitrary rule. This arbitrary rule is a type of algorithm, and you could use constant function, right? You could use something like the constant product or constant sum or whatever it happens to be. But in this case, we're just going to say the first apple is worth 1 cent, right? The first customer that comes into your business and purchases the apple, you charge them 1 cent. But as soon as that apple's gone, the next apple is going to cost 2 cents. And so on and so forth. Fourth apple, 4th cents, fifth apple, 5th cents. Now, just reading off this chart, you can see that the protocol is always quoting a price that you can buy the next apple for. It's also quoting you a price that you can possibly sell the apple back to the merchant for, right? And these are the two different values. So if we kind of let this thing play out, you can imagine that whatever the market is determining, right, however many apples are being bought from this store is driving the price of apples up. And then as people sell apples back to that store, it drives the price of apples back down. And this is that kind of natural breathing in and out of the markets, right? I hope that many of you would have an appreciation that this is kind of a very elegant, mathematical demonstration for things like supply and demand. As the demand for apples is increasing, their price is going up, but just as a result of the algorithm that we created. You don't need someone to quote it. But now think about this situation from the viewpoint of the apple merchant, that they've sold these apples and realized some sort of price. We can see that at this point in the simulation, that they have sold 4 apples, 1, 2, 3, and 4 cents for a total of 10 cents. But the current market price of apples is now 4 cents. And so if you take the number of apples that they sold and multiply it by the current market price, what you'll find is that they've actually made an apparent loss, right? It's not a real loss, it's a kind of a virtual loss. But what it means is that if they had instead not set up their Apple economy this way and waited for someone else to set it up on their behalf, they actually might have made a greater profit than being the thing that actually supported that price discovery in the first place. This is a bit of a paradox. That 16 cents, by the way, I'm going to refer to this as the HODL value, which just means the valuation of your portfolio when you decide not to make markets with it. And of course, the idea is to beat that value, right? If you are providing liquidity, which has transaction costs, it's got the stress of learning how to use a new protocol. If you're not making additional value out of that activity, then why would users continue to perform that activity? Which is a big problem, because as I just demonstrated in the slides leading up to this, I do think decentralized liquidity markets are critical to making sure cryptocurrency markets continue to perform the way that they should. So this 60% difference in value, we often call an impermanent loss. The reason it's impermanent is that if the price of apples goes back to 1 cent, technically the liquidity provider hasn't actually made any losses, and their HODL value becomes equal to their market making value. Now, for the more mathematically inclined, there is actually a very easy way to describe this, which is if you take any 2 points on the curve, be aware that there is an infinite number of different gradients between any 2 points on this triangle. And you are actually selling all of those infinite number of prices on the way to any other point. And so rather than having these like 1 cent buckets that we were selling apples at, it's actually a full continuum, which is why we call liquidity pools and AMMs a continuous liquidity product. So the only thing you need to appreciate is that as the thing that is going down in quantity, as it goes down in quantity, its value is always increasing. And there is these are redundant statements. If the quantity of something is decreasing, its value is increasing. And as the value of something is increasing, its quantity is decreasing. These are symmetrical arguments. And so if you want to derive an equation to actually calculate it without having to refer to number of apples sold or something like that, because you've got an infinite sum there, there's actually, you can rearrange or you can define, the value of the automatic market maker portfolio this way, and the HODL portfolio value. And then just compare those, and you get this expression out. And the good thing about this particular equation, there's so many different ways I've seen impermanent loss represented, is that this one has no knowledge of US dollars, no euros, no Swiss francs. It is just the percentage that you would have lost relative to not doing anything at all. And it's not denominated in any currency. This is a unitless number. So the question is, how can you make this profitable? If you're always losing value, no matter which way you're trading on the curve, remember, the x-axis is arbitrary. If you wanted to, you could flip that thing 45 degrees and end up with exactly the same bonding curve. So it's not that trading in one direction is like no profits and trading in the other direction is profits. It's actually losing value in both directions. And that is not necessarily, I think, a controversial issue, because finance has already figured that out for us. You charge fees for these things, right? Market makers have been doing this for decades. So I want to return to this Apple merchant model, but now looking at what happens when you apply fees to it. And I've curated a very specific example just to demonstrate my point. So we're going to start with the same situation, but now, after that apple is sold for 1 cent, we're going to say that we're adding just a tenth of a cent on top of it, right? So a 1/10 fee, which is quite high, but I think for the sake of clarity, it's the one I chose. And we're going to do that for every apple that's ever sold. And so now we're not just saying that you can buy the protocol, buy apples from the protocol for the price it's quoted, but you have to buy apples from the protocol for the price quoted plus a small commission. And if you take the commission when someone's buying it, you have to take commission when someone's selling it as well. And this is how market makers make money. This is especially how automatic market makers make money. It's from volatility, not from gross price movements. So if we let this simulation play out, again, we're looking at people selling and buying apples. And every time, all I'm doing is taking the sum of the cost and then just dividing it by 10 and adding that as a commission. And so after a few trades, we end up with a situation where the merchant has collected 3 cents in fees, but they've also collected 1, 2, and 3 cents from the gross revenue of selling the apples. And so if you add these things together, you get a 9 cent overall revenue. And if you compare that to the number of apples sold and the current market price for that apple, you'll see that these numbers are actually the same, right? So this is a situation where, because we've added a fee, and again, I've deliberately manipulated this, but it's a very small number of trades, so I don't feel too bad about it. But what I've shown is that it's easy to catch up to that HODL value price, and it stands to reason then that you should be able to defeat it as well, right? It is possible for an AMM to beat the HODL condition, and in fact, they beat it rather regularly. The problem is that opportunity risk is unpredictable for a discrete asset. No one knows what the price of Ethereum is going to be tomorrow, right? No one knows what the price of Chainlink is going to be tomorrow. And so if you're comparing it against these other assets and you're trying to work out, is this a good market-making situation for me? You're lying to yourself if you think you've got it figured out, right? There are very sophisticated market makers in the space that have got much better, much more sophisticated AI tools than you do, and even they haven't managed to figure it out, because the market is quasi-random. But that quasi-randomness, combined with things like the law of large numbers, means that the more assets that you have in your protocol, the larger the protocol is, the overall performance of the protocol actually does become predictable. You have no idea where the specific losses are going to be. You don't know if it's going to be on Chainlink or Bitcoin or Ethereum or anything else. But you can actually start to forecast how much the protocol's liability is likely to increase over time. And that is one of the major realizations behind the design of Bancor version 2.1 and continues into the design of Bancor version 3. Because we're not just making markets with apples, we have all of these different tokens, right? Bancor version 2.1 currently has more than 150. Bancor version 3, still in a soft launch at the moment, only has 3 tokens, but we're onboarding the rest of the catalog probably later next week. And because each one of these liquidity providers is participating in the system, and that they are all worried, right, that they're not going to be able to beat their HODL value, you actually have something like what could be an insurance mutual. Everyone shares a small part of their fee revenue with the protocol, and the protocol, which is not human, which has no sell motive, only uses that revenue that it collects to pay out liquidity providers when they withdraw if they failed to beat the HODL value. That's it. And so it means if you're a liquidity provider on Bangkor, you are guaranteed to be made whole on the way out. And that is, I think, really profound. And so we call this impermanent loss protection. I refer to it as an insurance model. And it is, the only AMM in the space besides Thorchain kind of that's offering this kind of thing. We did develop it on our own. We spent more than 18 months experimenting with it, and we are now, further refining it. So I've established that our protocol protects its users, and I think that that is, I think that we should be proud of what we've done there. But what it doesn't address is how the risk is mitigated. It's not enough just to say that a risk is predictable, because the predictable risk might be catastrophically high, right? It's like, like earthquake insurance. There's no premium that anyone can actually pay that would allow, for example, the entire, state of California to be rebuilt. So that risk has to be mitigated somehow. What I did was study the protocol Uniswap version 3. I'm sorry that some of the text seems to have been cut off there, but this says half of Uniswap liquidity providers are losing money. My research team and I spent a lot of time going through every single transaction on Uniswap v3 late last year, every single liquidity provider position, and we wrote a research paper and published it on Archive that was immediately picked up by NASDAQ and published on their website that shows that this concentrated liquidity idea, it's actually losing money. And like I said earlier in my presentation, we actually came out with a concentrated liquidity model that was, was also underperforming the HODL position frequently. So this wasn't huge news to us, but we felt that it was news to the industry, and so we decided to spend the time looking at it. So how does Uniswap v3 do it, and why is it losing money? So this is the standard bonding curve, and you can treat this as someone providing liquidity to it is funding all possible prices, right? Up to positive infinity and down to very close to zero, or 0 plus epsilon. What Uniswap v3 allows you to do is to choose a specific segment of this curve that you wish to provide liquidity to. And so, it's perfectly dynamic. There's no limitation to where you might provide liquidity. And Uniswap espouses that this is something similar to like an RFQ model or like a limit order function on chain, which is a good argument. But I want to have a look at if you draw a little box around somewhere you might have provided your liquidity and just blow that up, right? Because a lot of liquidity providers on Uniswap provide very, very concentrated liquidity, very, very tight bands. If you blow up that one segment, it starts to look like a straight line, okay? And this is very well approximated by something called the constant sum market making algorithm, which was actually first established by mstable. And what I'm going to do right now is compare how constant sum compares against constant product with regards to the number of tokens that you lose. So for example, if we're right in the midpoint of both of these curves, they both have 10 X and Y tokens each. Look what happens when we start to move down this curve. So in this case, a user has spent another 5 X tokens, and in the constant sum situation, has extracted 5 Y tokens in the process, but in the constant product situation, has extracted less than that. What I want you to realize here is that if you're trading on constant sum as a liquidity provider, you are losing tokens faster. You are actually selling tokens at a discount compared to constant product. And what if you go all the way to the bottom of the axis there, right, where that line crashes into itself? Is anyone a liquidity provider on Uniswap v3, by the way? Have you ever been moved out of range? That's exactly what I'm demonstrating here, right? That's when the price moves out and you end up entirely in the underperforming asset. And so in this case, when we crash into the x-axis there, you only have 20 X tokens as a liquidity provider. But the same situation with the same amount of liquidity on constant product, you would still have 5 of the Y tokens. And it's pretty clear, right? If you could just compare these two situations, they both have 20 X tokens, but one of them has 0 Y, the other one still has 5 Y. That's an interesting realization. And this is a calculation that you can perform on the back of an envelope. The take-home message is that leverage is dangerous, right? And this way of concentrating liquidity to within tight trading ranges, it is a type of leverage. And that should come as no surprise. The Uniswap team has correctly demonstrated that these types of concentrated pools perform like they're a lot deeper than they are, right? You can have a $50,000 pool behave like it's a $500 million pool. But that doesn't mean it's a $500 million pool. There is still only $50,000 worth of liquidity there. And so if you're pretending, right, or if you're acting like it's a $500 million pool, of course, the market is going to absorb it more quickly. So how did they get there, right? What was the genius behind Uniswap v3? And by the way, I want to be clear, I actually admire Uniswap v3. I think it's a really terrific product, and I think that the Uniswap team should be extremely proud of what they've accomplished. But this is their process. If you start with a constant product curve like this one and just blow it up, right? That is essentially how you end up at the protocol that Uniswap v3 has created. And you can see that it's starting to approximate a straight line there. So if this is risky, right? If this results in greater losses for liquidity providers, what do you think is an intelligent response? Why don't you just do the opposite? Instead of blowing up the curve, why don't you move it over? This we're calling the Bancor 3 infinity pool. And what it means is that as that line is approaching asymptotically one of the axes, that there is a buffer zone there, which means that essentially the Bancor 3 liquidity pool, it has the option to refuse to make markets with all of the tokens that it has. So just let that sink in for a second. Uniswap says we've got a $50,000 pool that's behaving like a $500 million pool. And that's great. I think that there are some very good, very clever arguments for why a product like that should exist, especially if you're a sophisticated trader. But if you're not a sophisticated trader, this is the break, right? This is the thing that prevents you from losing catastrophic amounts of money if you're a liquidity provider. And if you're a liquidity protocol like us that's insuring you, this is one of the ways that we can actually mitigate the losses that would otherwise be experienced if we made markets with everything that the protocol had access to. Again, it's confusing. I get it, right? This is very non-intuitive. If you haven't dealt with the geometry, before, the effect of moving the curve over and creating that buffer zone is really, it's difficult to visualize or difficult to anticipate. So let's just go back to the Apple merchant example and have a look at what these two different approaches do, the blowing up the bonding curve and the contracting or moving the liquidity curve. So the Uniswap v3 example, the concentrated liquidity example, looks like this. Rather than have each Apple selling for 1 cent more each time, you let the price adjust more slowly, right? So in this case, you can sell up to 3 apples for 1 cent, and then up to another 3 apples for 2 cents, and another 3 apples for 3 cents, or it's supposed to be, and so on and so forth. And so this is effectively that liquidity amplification, right? That concentrated liquidity effect, where the price moves more slowly. Okay, so what about the Bancor infinity pool? It's exactly the opposite. The price moves slightly more quickly, which in a way also suggests that the markets might be slightly more volatile, or at least trading on Bangkor might be slightly more volatile, which is good because volatility drives fees. But here's the demonstration. How many apples do you need to sell before you discover a price of X? Okay? Like, let's say that the market was happy to pay 3 cents for an apple. Which one of these methods realizes that price discovery first? In the first one, which let's call it constant product, you sell 3 apples before the market says, fine, we're at 3 cents and this is kind of where price equilibrium is. And maybe there's going to be trading back and forth between 5 cents and 4 cents or something. What about the concentrated liquidity? You have to sell 8 of them in this case, right? That's a large number of apples. And remember, the merchant isn't really making any more money. They are still selling apples at a discount leading up to that state. And if the aim, right, if the purpose of an AMM is at least partly to facilitate price discovery, which I think it is, then the capital efficiency argument that I've heard for concentrated liquidity, I actually don't think stands up. I think that it stands up in cases where we are considering something like Uniswap v3 to be like an OTC protocol or an RFQ protocol. But in terms of the efficiency at which it allows the market to determine the price of an asset, you actually have to sell a lot more of that asset to arrive at the same conclusion. And the Bancor infinity pool, potentially, we can do it with only 2 apples, right? We got to 3 cents much faster, and that's where the equilibrium price should be. And that means that because we still have all of these tokens in the liquidity pool, when the user goes to withdraw, the amount of liquidity available to them to withdraw from is much greater, the insurance liability is significantly reduced, and the overall health and of the protocol and happiness of the users is higher. If nothing else, what I want you to take away from this presentation is that Bangkor represents the interests of liquidity providers. And to my mind, this is a niche that we occupy entirely by ourselves. And I think that's really sad. I do think that decentralized liquidity markets are important. And I do think that the type of manipulation that we saw that led to, for example, the meltdown of the Terra ecosystem may be averted if we don't allow centralized market makers to have as much control over the crypto markets as they currently do. And I don't think that it's going to be the last time we see something like this. It may not have even been the first. I've recently, been on many threads, some that are extremely credible, that are trying to work out just how many times crypto market crashes have been orchestrated. And this isn't necessarily, conspiracy theory, tinfoil hat wearing nonsense. These are people that are actually doing sort of, forensic accounting and trying to work out where these things go. And it's possible that it happens quite frequently, and I think that that's extremely sad. And I think that liquidity protocols like ours, even like Uniswap, is the best defense that we have against that type of market manipulation. That's the end of my talk, and I really hope that you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions and you want to see me after the talk, I encourage it. These are my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me on any of them. I'm currently inundated right now because we are in the middle of a product release. But I promise I answer every single email, every single Telegram message, every single Twitter DM. Yeah. I hope to see you guys at the VIP dinner, at least some of you. And I'm going to be hanging around tomorrow. We have a booth just outside, and so if you'd like to come and have a conversation with me there, I encourage it. We've got about 8 minutes left on the timer if anyone has any questions, and thank you so much for your attention. Yes. Just shout out your question, I'll repeat it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so the question is that I spoke briefly about price discovery. And the audience member wants me to compare Bankor's price discovery versus something like Balancer. Balancer is an extremely good choice, by the way. So Bankor's one is all constant product, with this buffer region, but still constant product. And so what that means is that no matter where you are on the bonding curve, the rate of price change is the same. Balancer has a much more let's say elegant way of sort of generalizing the constant product algorithm, where it's, if anyone wants to look it up, it's called the strong invariant. And importantly, allows for bonding not just of 2 assets, but any number of assets. So you can have 3, 4, 5. But even when it's just the 2, you find that the constant product version is simply a special case of strong invariant where the exponents on both of those numbers are 1, right? So x to the 1 times y to the 1 equals k. With balancers, you can screw with those exponents so long as the sum of them is still 1. So you can have, for example, x to the power of 0.8 times y to the power of 0.2 equals k, and you still get a type of bonding curve, but it's skewed. And that skew means that price discovery is biased in one direction, and that's deliberate, right? This isn't a design flaw. This was deliberately built into the protocol by Balancer. And I think you mentioned bootstrapping, right? Yeah, the bootstrapping. Yeah, so the reason why you want that skew sometimes is that when you've got, for example, a new token, it can take a little while for the market to sort of start to rest on what the fair price is. And so you don't necessarily want violent price discovery in the, in the beginning stages of it. So interestingly, so I do think the balances model is terrific. I think that the strong invariant has a very specific use case, especially for things like index tokens, if you want to create like a large bucket of them, and that they can all realize a price versus each other without having a common numeraire is brilliant. For things like initial token price discovery, I do think that there might be better mechanisms, and I have been investigating these for about a year. And so, for example, there are protocols such as like Juicebox and DAO Maker that have sort of these lockup systems and use, again, constant product, but with an incentives model that tries to sort of adjust the price slowly, or at least limit how fast something can be sold or bought. And that's fine. But of all of the, remember what I said about the apples, right? It's just a rule, right? We can apply any bonding curve. If you can imagine a bonding curve, so long as it's got a unique point at any, at any X and Y value, then you can make a market using that algorithm. And I think that balances one in terms of price discovery for bootstrapping tokens is good, but I don't think that it's perfect for all use cases. I think starting with something like constant sum, which gives, for example, early investors the ability to get cold feet and leave from their investment should they want to without impacting the token, is actually something that should be investigated. I think that you can also then take that, that same principle and slowly bend a constant sum curve into a constant product curve, which is exactly the opposite of what I demonstrated here by zooming in on a section. Instead, you would zoom out on it. And so you can dial in price discovery at a certain rate as a market for a certain token matures. Balances is good, and they can do it as well because you can change the exponents over time. But yeah, it's a burgeoning field, right? I doubt that we've seen the last of price discovery mechanisms, and I'm looking forward to contributing a little bit to that myself. Thank you so much for your question. Does anyone else have? I know it's a long day. Do you guys want to go? Okay, thank you so much.